John Miller, the man once convicted for the gruesome Snowtown murders, walked free after 26 years behind bars, leaving a town haunted by fear, unanswered questions, and shocking revelations. In the quiet suburb of Snowtown, life had always seemed calm and ordinary. Families went about their routines, children played in the streets, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves. People trusted one another, believing that nothing dangerous could disturb the peaceful rhythm of their lives. That sense of security would soon be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. It began with a strange discovery. Authorities stumbled upon a series of barrels hidden in abandoned buildings and empty lots around the town. At first, no one could understand what was inside, and curiosity mixed with unease spread among the residents. When the barrels were finally opened, the truth was revealed. Human bodies, carefully concealed but brutally killed, were inside. Shock turned into terror as the scale of the crime became clear. The town, once a safe haven, now felt like a cage filled with invisible threats. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the community had ever seen. Police combed through every detail, searching for clues in a case that seemed almost impossible to unravel. The murders were not random acts of violence. They were deliberate, methodical, and chillingly cold. Each victim had been carefully selected, and the killings were carried out with precision. The thought that someone capable of such cruelty could live among them was almost too much to bear. Rumors began to circulate. Whispers of neighbors who seemed just a little too secretive, friends who suddenly became strangers. Fear spread faster than the news, infecting every corner of the town. People began locking their doors and watching one another closely, unsure who could be trusted. As the investigation progressed, suspicion fell on one man. At first, he appeared to be an ordinary citizen, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life. But detectives uncovered evidence linking him to the murders, painting a horrifying picture of a calculated killer hiding in plain sight. The details of the crimes were so grotesque that the public could barely comprehend them. The man was arrested and charged, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the horror of the acts he was accused of committing. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Courtrooms were filled with journalists, families of the victims, and townspeople desperate for answers. The story of Snowtown, once just another quiet town, dominated headlines across the country. Witnesses testified about the man's behavior, describing a chilling ability to manipulate and control those around him. Experts detailed the psychological patterns of a killer who seemed almost beyond comprehension. Evidence was presented in painstaking detail, from the physical traces at the crime scenes to the subtle connections between each victim. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who had orchestrated a reign of terror, leaving behind a trail of fear and death. When the verdict was finally delivered, the town held its collective breath. The man was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison, and for a moment, justice seemed to have been served. Residents allowed themselves a fragile sense of relief, believing the nightmare was finally over. Snowtown's streets felt a little safer, though the scars of the murders would never fully heal. Little did anyone know that this sense of closure would be challenged decades later, in a way no one could have anticipated. 26 years passed since the shocking Snowtown murders first captured the nation's attention. The man convicted for orchestrating the killings had spent more than a quarter of a century behind bars, his name synonymous with fear and horror. During those long years, the town had slowly tried to move on. Streets became familiar again. Children grew up without the constant shadow of terror, and families attempted to rebuild their lives. Yet the memory of the murders never fully faded. People whispered about the man in prison, wondering if justice had truly been served or if some hidden truth had been overlooked. It was a question that lingered quietly, almost like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Behind the closed doors of law offices and research centers, a small group of experts began examining the Snowtown case once more. Forensic science had advanced dramatically since the original investigation. Techniques that had not existed decades earlier now allowed for a more thorough analysis of evidence. What had once seemed conclusive began to show cracks under the scrutiny of modern technology. Tiny details in witness statements, previously dismissed, suddenly appeared inconsistent. Items of evidence were discovered to have been mishandled, stored improperly, or misinterpreted at the time of the trial. Each revelation added layers of doubt, and the more the case was reviewed, the more unsettling it became. Lawyers quietly filed petitions for a review of the conviction. Initially, their efforts attracted little attention, hidden away in legal archives and courtrooms far removed from the eyes of the public. But as new evidence emerged, interest grew. Journalists began digging into the case again, uncovering inconsistencies in testimony and pointing out potential mistakes in the original investigation. Some witnesses had recanted or admitted to being coerced, while others had misremembered crucial details under pressure. The combination of forensic advances and witness re-evaluations began painting a very different picture than the one presented during the sensational trial decades ago. For the first time in many years, the man behind bars had a glimmer of hope. He had spent years in silence, enduring the harsh routine of prison life, reflecting on the world outside and the life he had lost. The review process gave him a new opportunity, a chance to challenge the story that had defined him for more than 2 decades. The quiet tension of anticipation spread through the legal system. Judges and investigators approached the case with caution, knowing that overturning a conviction of this magnitude could be explosive both legally and socially. As the review progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Snowtown murders were far more complex than anyone had originally believed. The possibility that the convicted man may not have been fully responsible, or perhaps had been wrongly accused altogether, began to take root. Every piece of evidence was re-examined, every witness re-evaluated, and every conclusion questioned. The sleepy town that had once thought it was safe now faced the unsettling reality that the truth might not be as simple as they had been told. And as the legal world prepared for its next move, one thing was certain. The story of Snowtown was far from over, and the coming revelations would shock the community in ways no one could imagine. As the review process gained momentum, Snowtown found itself gripped by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. For years, the town had believed the man in prison was the mastermind behind the horrifying murders. Now, new revelations threatened to unravel everything the residents thought they knew. Investigators discovered that key testimonies from the original trial were unreliable. Some witnesses admitted to being pressured into statements they could not fully verify, while others had been influenced by fear, personal grudges, or the chaotic nature of the original investigation. The careful threads that had once held the prosecution's case together were now fraying, revealing gaps that no one had fully understood before. Physical evidence also came under intense scrutiny. Items that had once been considered decisive proof were re-examined with modern forensic techniques. Hair samples, fibers, and fingerprints were tested using methods unavailable during the initial trial, and the results were startling. Some evidence previously attributed to the convicted man could not be definitively linked to him, while traces that had been dismissed as insignificant now raised serious questions. Experts explained that mistakes in the handling of crime scenes, contamination of evidence, and rushed analyses had likely influenced the outcome of the trial. For a case that had seemed airtight in the public eye, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The media quickly caught wind of these developments, reporting every new detail with urgency. Headlines questioned whether the man had been wrongly imprisoned, sparking heated debates online and in the community. People who had once felt secure now wondered if the true perpetrator might have remained free, hiding in plain sight for decades. Families of the victims, who had grieved and accepted the official story, were now forced to confront uncertainty. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded that the man remain behind bars, fearing he was still dangerous, while others argued that justice required a reevaluation of the evidence. The tension in Snowtown grew palpable, as if the town itself was holding its breath. As the review committee delved deeper, a pattern emerged. It was clear that procedural errors and bias had played a role in the original conviction. The committee carefully weighed each piece of evidence, considering what had been overlooked or misinterpreted. Psychological evaluations, witness credibility, and forensic results were all re-examined in detail. The findings pointed to one inescapable conclusion. There were significant doubts about the man's guilt. Enough doubt, in fact, to challenge the foundation of the entire conviction. The announcement of these findings sent shockwaves through the town. A sense of disbelief mingled with anticipation. Residents could not reconcile the horrors of the Snowtown murders with the possibility that the person they had blamed might not have been fully responsible. Authorities prepared to present the review to a judge, knowing that the next decision would be historic. In a town still haunted by the past, a dramatic twist was about to change the narrative forever, forcing Snowtown and its residents to confront a reality they had never imagined. The day of the release arrived with an intensity that few in Snowtown could have anticipated. News crews lined the streets outside the prison, their cameras trained on the gates that had held the convicted man for 26 long years. Residents gathered cautiously, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. The quiet town that had once known peace now seemed electric with tension. People whispered among themselves, some expressing outrage, others nervous anticipation. The idea that the man could walk free after decades of imprisonment seemed surreal, almost impossible, and yet the court had ruled in his favor. When the prison gates finally opened, he stepped into the sunlight for the first time in over a quarter of a century. His expression was unreadable, calm and composed, giving nothing away about his inner thoughts. Every step he took was documented by cameras and watched by hundreds of onlookers. The reactions were immediate and polarized. Some people recoiled, their fear resurfacing as they remembered the brutality of the murders. Others felt a strange sense of justice finally being served, convinced that the law had corrected a monumental mistake. Emotions ran high, and the crowd's energy was almost palpable, a mixture of anger, confusion, and morbid fascination. Families of the victims, who had endured years of grief and tried to move forward, were thrown back into uncertainty. Their sense of closure, painstakingly built over decades, had evaporated overnight. Some refused to even look at him, turning their faces away in anger or sorrow. Others lingered, desperate for answers they might never receive. While the man's release was legally justified, it offered no comfort or explanation to those left behind. The streets of Snowtown, once quiet and familiar, now felt like a stage for a drama they were unwilling participants in. Authorities and local officials were quick to remind the public that his release did not mean he had been declared innocent. The ruling highlighted procedural errors, mismanaged evidence, and inconsistencies in testimony, but the shadow of suspicion still lingered. Residents were warned to remain vigilant, and law enforcement maintained a presence in key areas to prevent potential confrontations. Social media exploded with opinions, theories, and fears, with many speculating about whether the man could pose a threat or if he had indeed been wrongfully convicted. Snowtown had entered a new chapter in its dark history, one where uncertainty and tension replaced the fragile sense of safety the town had regained over the years. As he walked away from the prison gates, blending into the outside world once more, the man seemed almost detached from the reactions around him. 26 years had shaped him into someone who had endured isolation, reflection, and survival. His freedom was real, but it was also a reminder of how deeply flawed the original investigation had been. Snowtown residents were left grappling with the shocking reality that a chapter they had thought closed was, in fact, only beginning again. The town's collective psyche had been shaken to its core, and the story of the murders, the trial, and the man's release would continue to haunt them, a chilling reminder that the truth is often far more complex than it appears. Even after the man's release, the shadow of the Snowtown murders loomed over the town. The streets that once felt safe now carried an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. People glanced at one another with suspicion, wondering if the horrors of the past could return or if the real truth had ever been uncovered. The official record stated that he had been released due to inconsistencies and mishandling of evidence, but the community was left with a deeper, more unsettling question. If he was not entirely responsible, who was? The uncertainty gnawed at residents, leaving a restless tension in homes, schools, and workplaces. The memory of the barrels, the gruesome details, and the stories of the victims refused to fade. Investigators continued to dig into the Snowtown case, now with renewed urgency. Cold leads, forgotten witnesses, and overlooked details were re-examined with modern forensic tools. Each new piece of information added to the complexity, sometimes clarifying, sometimes deepening the mystery. Even as the man attempted to reclaim his life, investigators were quietly chasing threads that might reveal the full story, knowing that decades of fear and speculation had left questions that might never be fully answered. The community watched with a mixture of fascination and dread, unable to detach themselves from a narrative that had shaped their town for generations. The families of the victims were caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger and grief remained, now mixed with confusion and helplessness. Some demanded renewed investigations, desperate to find closure or perhaps the real culprit. Others wrestled with the possibility that the man they had blamed for so long might have been innocent, or at least not entirely guilty. The unresolved nature of the case made it impossible to move on completely, and every familiar street, house, and park became a reminder of a past that refused to let go. Even in the simplest daily routines, the weight of the murders and the subsequent legal twists lingered like a quiet, constant hum. The man himself remained a figure of mystery and tension. Despite being free, he carried the burden of a life defined by crime and punishment, whether fully deserved or not. His calm demeanor and quiet movements in the town only heightened speculation. Some believed he was a changed man, a victim of circumstance, while others feared he retained the capacity for violence. The uncertainty made him an unsettling presence, a living reminder that the line between guilt and innocence is not always clear. Snowtown had to reconcile the fact that the man walking among them might never reveal the truth, and the haunting question of who was truly responsible could remain unanswered. In the end, the story of Snowtown became more than a tale of gruesome murders. It became a story about doubt, human error, and the fragile nature of justice. The town had endured fear, grief, and the shock of decades-long imprisonment, only to face a reality filled with ambiguity and unease. Snowtown's history would forever be marked by the barrels, the victims, and the man who walked free after 26 years. The community, the families, and even the investigators were left with a chilling realization. Some truths may never be fully known, and sometimes freedom and guilt exist in ways that defy understanding. The town could rebuild, life could resume, but the echoes of the past would never fully disappear. Snowtown had learned that the darkest chapters often leave the longest shadows, and the story of the murders, the trial, and the shocking release would linger forever in memory, unanswered and haunting.